I started writing very young. I made my decision to become a writer when I was 13 years old, and I started writing steadily after that. Of course, I went to college, but then I got a PhD at Columbia University. So, and I was writing poems, mostly poems at that time. Published my first poem in 1980, not long after I moved to New York. And, but I wrote a dissertation, published my first novel in 92. So my life has, in a way, become more complex since then. I go back and forth now between writing fiction and nonfiction. Since I published The Shaking Woman, or A History of My Nerves, which I think did not really have such an enormous popular life, but it became an important book in neurology, medicine, and some neuroscientists. And people then started to ask me to speak and to publish in scientific journals, et cetera, et cetera. So I now have a very interesting double life between doing scholarly work and writing fiction. I wouldn't have predicted that. It is interesting to think about how the fiction and nonfiction interact for me, because after having spent years studying neuroscience, trying to figure out how to educate myself well enough to become a reader of neuroscience papers. That was my goal, and it worked. All you need to do is take the time. Anyone can do it, actually. I think unlike turning yourself into a physicist at a late age, an intelligent, educated person can definitely become literate in the neuroscience literature. It's not impossible. I did that, and then I began to see that there were some difficulties with the models in neuroscience. What exactly were they talking about in terms of the psychological and the physiological? How did it work? Well, there's a gap, and there really is no model that unifies them entirely. So the mind-body problem remains, and I was thrown back into 17th century philosophy because of this. During my excursion back into the 17th century, I discovered Margaret Cavendish. Margaret Cavendish, I think, is one of the great philosophical geniuses of that period, and she then returned in my novel, The Blazing World. She figures as a person of interest for the main character, Harriet Burden. And that novel is in part an ongoing exploration of the mind-body problem. So these two parts of myself are not divorced. They keep returning in various forms, both in the fiction and the nonfiction. My vision is that we don't cease to specialize in disciplines, but that there will be, and I think there is now, more and more conversation among the disciplines, especially between the arts and the sciences, the humanities and the sciences. I think we need both. I think the culture has a tendency to value empiricism and value science more, and to think of science in masculine terms and the arts and the humanities in feminine terms. And this turns out to be not so good for the humanities and the arts. You know, that it's fluffy and imaginary and not so terribly important. What we really need is data, data, data. But without theory, the data is meaningless. It's truly meaningless. Everyone has to interpret data, however that's coming at you. And how we interpret is also the business of philosophy and the humanities and the arts. I do think that what happens, I'm very interested in what happens when artists make a work of art, or let's take the novel, when a novelist is working on a book. The experience is something quite odd, but many writers, and I myself experience it, I have the feeling that the book knows more than I do, that I am in service to the book rather than the other way around. And if I'm trying to control the book, it's not very good. So clearly unconscious processes for me are very important to producing a work of fiction. At the same time, I think those same unconscious processes are at work while I'm writing nonfiction. So the insight, whether it's in the sciences or in the arts, is something that appears. Often you don't know how it happened. Why did you suddenly have this insight? Mathematicians have talked about this. Einstein talked about intuition and its role in his work. So I think physicists and poets are not as different as we like to think. The same unconscious processes are at work in both. I understand deeply, and I do say it in the introduction to A Woman Looking at Men, Looking at Women, that we will not change the epistemologies of various disciplines. Epistemology is just how do you know what you know. A scientist uses the scientific method. An artist uses other tools, including intuition. I think scientists use intuition as well. But the epistemologies will stand. What I am interested in is using multiple models. If you ask a question, a big question, say, what are human beings? In order to understand human beings, these sophisticated mammals, what do we do? What are we? If you apply a scientific model, an artistic model, a historical model, to that same question, you will not get a single answer, but you will come up with what I call a focused zone of ambiguity, right? To think about human beings, I think you can't leave out the particular environment that a person is in. You can't leave out the biology. We are biological creatures and we are limited by our biology. Human beings don't fly, right? That's part of our existence, is that we can get in a plane, but we can't just lift off. And if you neglect one of these important aspects, you will get stuck in a tunnel. And so I am for psychologists consulting historians, for biologists thinking through problems in philosophy. And not because I believe that everyone should be well-rounded and be a very scintillating human being at a cocktail party. That is not what I'm talking about. I think that people working very hard in their own disciplines will be able to solve problems better in their own work if they are able to adopt multiple perspectives on a problem. So people should regard this as a selfish benefit, a benefit to the work itself. As I tried to explain in the introduction, was that this meeting between artists and scientists was organized at Columbia University. I think it was well-meaning, and it's a good idea. I think visual artists and people who study visual perception should engage in a dialogue. What happened, however, was that each scientist was given a stage, essentially, to give a complete lecture. And then after those scientific lectures, a panel of visual artists was assembled, and they were asked then to respond to the scientists. This is not a good idea. First of all, each artist was assaulted in terms of narcissism, you know, because artists are used to having a stage alone. And so they were grouped together to respond to the science that they really knew nothing about. That was a bad idea. I think that a much better idea is, for example, you think of someone like David Hockney, who has contributed to understanding how certain, it's controversial, but how certain paintings are made. He understood the process of how an artist is reproducing, say, a visual experience. And scientists are very interested in this, and artists can help. But if you create a hierarchy, science on top, art on the bottom, dialogue will not be possible. Why are some people curious? Or why are some people more curious than other people? I really find that to be a fascinating question. And I confess that there are times when I run into a whole new discourse. You know, I start reading something and there's a whole new world that has opened up to me. And I think, oh no, I have to start from square one. You know, I have to order a textbook, introduction to whatever it is. So I haven't given up yet. And of course, one can never get to the end. I think what one hopes for, what I always hope for, is that I find myself in a better position to ask the next question, to ask a sophisticated question about a problem. Now, I do think that as I have aged, I have read and read and read and read because I am interested in mastery. You don't ever master everything, you know, you don't do it, but that it gives you a flexibility of mind that I certainly did not have when I was younger. A kind of synthetic possibility that gives me immense pleasure, really great pleasure. You know, seeing connections that I would have been blind to had I not done all this homework, so to speak.